In the last episode, the Ming under Li Rusong were defeated, though I really do have to admire his show of bravery at the end. Now this time we're going to discuss what the Koreans were doing around the same time. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. The aftermath of the battle was uncomfortable for the Ming Chosun allied armies. Yu Song-nyang urged the Chinese commander Li Rusong that they should try once again to attack Seoul. Li told him no, giving him the reason that he didn't like how the season had made the ground wet and muddy. That these weren't the conditions that he would let his men fight in. The commander then withdrew his men to the Imjin River, and then to Kaesong, then back to Pyongyang. The capital of Seoul was, well, a mess at this point. There were still tons of corpses all over the place from the recent battle, and on top of that, on February 24th in the morning, local Korean citizens had started fires to assist their liberators. The problem was that the Chinese had already pulled back from the area, and this wasn't actually helping anyone. It actually led to a pretty severe blowback, as many of the Korean men in the area were then executed to prevent further sabotage. The Japanese, though, also burned down buildings and fields of grass, which would prevent the Ming from being able to feed their horses should they attack again. Even though the Japanese had beaten back the Ming, the commanders, well, they knew that they would be back. So the question for them was, should they stay and fight, or should they retreat south? Now Kato Kiyomasa, who had just returned from the north, joined Kobayakawa Takakage in opposing the idea of retreating. They thought that now was the time to fight and show what samurai were capable of. I mean, well, okay, most of the Japanese army weren't samurai, but you know what they meant. Kunichi Yukinaga and some of the other commanders in attendance weren't as sure, and definitely weren't enthusiastic about risking their lives just to prove a point. But retreating had risks too. The second they left the safety of Seoul's walls, their armies would be exposed. And even though the Ming had left to Pyongyang, the Japanese were actually surrounded by Korean warrior monks and armed civilians. And there was also still Korean government soldiers just north as well, such as Commander-in-Chief Kim Young-won at the Imjin River, General Yi Bin at Paju, and Generals Yi So-an and Ko On-baek at Hayu Pass. The fighting wasn't actually done either. For example, just 20 kilometers to the west, around 1,000 Korean warrior monks attacked a small Japanese force. Now, around half of the monks were actually killed, with fewer casualties on the Japanese side, but they still managed to make them retreat inside the city walls. Then, 2,000 monks under Yi Zhong attacked at Suraksan, just 10 kilometers in the northeast. They too lost half of their men while inflicting low casualties. But again, the Japanese retreated from the area and into Seoul. And 600 monks made an attack at Icheon in the southeast, once again taking heavy casualties, but succeeding in driving the Japanese back. Have you managed to see the trend yet? The Koreans were much more willing to die to reach their goals at this time than the Japanese were. And it didn't really matter how many the Japanese could kill. The Japanese simply could not replace any men that they lost at this time. And now they're also losing land. Haengju in the west was probably the biggest threat to the Japanese. There was around 2,300 under the command of Gwon Yul. Him and his men were in a wooden stockade overlooking the Han River. This was the same man that helped defend the Chola province at the Battle of Vichy. The Korean government, seeing the man's ability, decided to appoint him army commander of the Chola province. Gwon Yul, after a lot of consideration and his own personal experience, decided that the Japanese were incredibly skilled in combat on open ground. But his people excelled at fighting from behind fortress walls. So he decided that the best course of action was to repair the fort at Haengju, and the rear of the fort was protected by a steep drop-off into the Han River. And if an attack did come, the enemy would have to fight uphill. The only time he sent men out to attack was to attack enemy foraging parties and small groups of soldiers. Considering that the Ming had retreated from the area, this fortification was easily the greatest threat to the Japanese in Seoul, and on March 14th, they decided to confront the issue. Around half of the men stationed in Seoul left the city in the early hours of the morning under the commands of Kunishi Yukinaga, Ashita Mitsunari, Kuroda Nagamasa, Kobayakawa Takakage, and Hideyoshi's adopted son, the Supreme Commander Ukeda Hide. I should mention, though, that even though Commander Gwon Yul had 2,300 men and warrior monks under his command, there was also anywhere between 1,000 to 3,000 civilians also at Haengju. As the Japanese approached the base of the hill and started their preparations for battle, Gwon ordered his men to eat. He knew it would be a very long battle. The Japanese at this time were actually at a severe disadvantage. The matchlocks weren't able to fire at the walls due to the angle of the hill. Plus, they really didn't have time to lay out a long siege either. On the other hand, the Koreans didn't have that issue as their arrows could be fired in an arc. They also had several cannons and hwacha which they could use. The Japanese split into groups, and Kunishi Yukinaga stepped forward. His group would be the first to attack. Gwon Yul waited until the enemy were within range, and then started beating his drum to signal his men to start to fire. Every single cannon, hwacha, and bow loosed a tremendous barrage into the enemy. Kunishi's men pulled back, and then Ashita Mitsunari's people were up next, but were also driven back in the exact same way. Kuroda Nagamasa was the next to attack. However, the Battle of Yonan was still fresh on his mind, and he decided to take a more cautious approach. He decided to have makeshift siege towers built and then had his men fire their matchlocks from on top of them into the fort, and had the rest of his men hold back. The exchange of fire was actually intense for both sides, but due to the cannon fire, Kuroda's men abandoned the towers and they were then destroyed. Ukeda Hide was disappointed in the failed attacks and was very determined that his would be the one to push through the Korean defenses. He and his men were actually successful in smashing through the first wall and actually got into the inner wall. Ukeda was then wounded and had to retreat, with many of his men losing heart and following their commander in retreat. A unit of men under Kakawa Hiroi rushed forward to take advantage of the gap that Ukeda had made. The fighting was now at its most intense. The defenders fought back with everything they had, and the drums no longer sounded. Gwon Yul had drawn his sword and was now with his men fighting back the enemy. And at some point, large piles of dried grass were piled up by the wooden walls of the fort by the Japanese in an attempt to light them and set the whole fort ablaze. However, the Koreans were able to douse the flames with buckets of water. Kobayakawa Takakage led the next assault, and his men were actually able to knock a hole in the inner wall of the fort. The Koreans were actually able to hold the Japanese back just long enough to plug it up, though, with logs. The fighting kept up through the afternoon, and the Koreans at this time were close to breaking. Their supply of arrows were almost gone, and they were absolutely exhausted. When it seemed that the defenders would perish, what could only be described as a miracle happened. 2 Korean ships under the command of Yi Bun appeared on the Han, laden with arrows and reinforcements. Now, because of this, the defenders were able to hold out through 2 more waves of attacks. And as the sun started to fall, the Japanese thoroughly exhausted, well, they pulled back into Seoul. One Japanese soldier is said to have called the Han Sanzu no Kawa, or the River of Hell. And this is, of course, where I will leave you. The Koreans snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Now please make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you next time.